What brought you to this research? Let's do a little backstory on it.
Well, I was a big Beatle freak ever since I was a little kid. I've told this story a number of times, going back to 1968 when the Beatles came out with Yellow Submarine. I was well aware of the Beatles by that time. I was born in '59, so I was 9 years old when the movie came out, and I just bugged my parents to take me to the theater to see the film. And so finally my father relented, and he took my brother and I. My brother's just about 15 months younger than I am. He was another little Beatle freak. So the Beatles were the reason why I learned to play guitar. They taught me, by listening to their music, how to write music, to record music. So they were a huge influence in my life. I collected a lot of Beatle memorabilia over time. In fact, I have, well, it's smaller now because I sold off about half of it, but I had a huge vinyl collection of Beatle albums from all over the world. I collected for many, many years. And I guess about a month ago, I ran into another collector, and I told him what I had, and I was able to offload a good chunk of it. I kept the really valuable stuff. I still have that. He was interested in many of the records I had, a lot of the reissues, and some of the memorabilia, so he took that off my hands. The point I'm making is I was really, really, really into the Beatles. To this day, I still enjoy the music, and that led me into high school, which was around 1976. Yeah, 76. I was into the whole Paul is dead conspiracy. And I didn't believe that Paul was dead. I thought it was just an elaborate marketing ploy to sell more records, and the Beatles have always been sold to us as very clever, witty guys. I just thought it was a clever, witty thing that they were doing. But I loved taking a look at the clues on the albums and playing the songs backwards because the songs were backmasked and stuff like that. So my high school was very progressive back in the day, and they were open to having students bring in outside speakers. So I had a friend, Adam, and Adam had an older brother, Doug. Doug was about 5 years older than we were. And he had all the Beatle albums, and he knew all the Beatle clues from the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And so I asked Doug if he would come to the school and do a presentation, and he said, yeah, he would do it. So he did. And the day that we had the presentation, it was standing room only. And that was really when I really got into the Paul is Dead conspiracy. And like I said, I didn't believe that Paul was actually dead. I thought it was just a marketing gimmick. But then what happened was I was chugging along, still loving the Beatles. And then in 2016, I bought the book, The Memoirs of Billy Shears. And I bought it on a lark. I was on Amazon, and Amazon came up with recommendations and said, hey, we think you might like this book based upon other stuff that you've looked at and bought, which was Beatles stuff. And so I bought the book in 2016, and I started reading it. And when I started reading it, I couldn't believe what I was reading, because the story that's told in the Memoirs of Billy Shears is very, very different. So it presented a completely different backstory and narrative around the Beatles. That led me to taking a look at the book, breaking it down, decoding it, and figuring out whether the book was truthful or not. And to make a long story short, I've been at this now for 8 years, 2016 to 2024, and based upon my work, I concluded that the book is truthful. There are threads of fiction in the book. It's classified as historical fiction, and the reason for that is for reasons of plausible deniability, because the person behind the book, Billy Shears, the guy who's playing the part of Paul McCartney, and has been since late 1966, I believe it was September 11th of 66, that's what we're told in the book. So for almost 60 years, he's the person playing the part, and the book is written in the first person, so it's Billy speaking to us, it's Billy telling the story. The one thing, actually a big thing, that caught my attention with memoirs is the amount of detail in the book. There was so much detail that I thought to myself, this can only come from somebody that is either in the inner circle or is the person that's playing the role of Paul McCartney. And the book is authored by Thomas E.U. Harriot, but Tom is really the encoder. And the reason why he's referred to as the encoder is because the book is encoded, and you have to decode it in order to break the book down and get to the truth behind the Beatles story. So that's where we are today, and I've been at it for, like I said, for 8 years, getting into various aspects of the Beatles' unofficial story, and probably what I'll be known for, out of all the work that I've done, is questioning whether the Beatles wrote all their own music and played on all of their recorded tracks. So I think that has us up to date, Julia.
Well, great. Who has the hand up the puppet that we call the Beatles?
That could be a very lengthy answer. So we have to go back to organizations like the Frankfurt School out of Frankfurt, Germany. The Beatles were a creation of Tavistock. Now, this is told to us in memoirs, but it's also told to us in a book that came out in the early 1990s by Dr. John Coleman, titled The Committee of 300. So the book that Coleman wrote is not about the Beatles. It's about the control system that's in place and who's behind the curtain. And so Coleman spends a lot of time talking about the Committee of 300 and Tavistock. Tavistock reports into the committee. If you go back to the Frankfurt School, we're talking about cultural Marxism. The overall system from a secret society perspective comes under the umbrella of Freemasonry. But underneath Freemasonry, there are many other secret societies. It's a federation of secret societies. So you've got the Masons, you've got the Jesuits, you have the Rosicrucians, you have the Pilgrim Society, you have the Templars. And if you read another book that John Coleman wrote on Tavistock, and his book on Freemasonry is a very good book on Freemasonry, what you'll start to understand is the Masons are all about a completely different societal and cultural construct. Their concept, their idea of what this world is going to look like, and I say the world, not just the United States, is going to be, and we can already see it today, is very different than what it was when I was a kid. The amount of change that they're looking to implement is going to be even more drastic if they have their way as we march forward. So within Freemasonry, it's a pagan-based spiritual belief system. It goes back to the Egyptian mysteries. It goes back to Babylon, to the Babylonian priesthood. So what this means is that they are looking to implement, like I mentioned, a different system. And that different system means that they have to unravel and dismantle the current system. So what was the current system when this really got kicked off? Let's pick a date or a year, 1960. It was going on before that, but we'll look at 1960 because that's when the counterculture really got kicked into high gear. They're looking to dismantle the traditional values, the traditional family structure, traditional institutionalized religion, and in particular, Christianity. So if you read John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, what he tells you is that the Freemasons absolutely despise Christianity. Even though they will deny it, they despise it. So it's got to be removed. And the reason why it's got to be removed is not because they just despise it. It's because it's in the way of where they're going. Their God is Lucifer. And John Coleman explains, I think it's by the 26th degree in Freemasonry, and we're talking about the 33 degrees of the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry. At the 26th degree, for those who make it to that degree, that is when it's revealed to them that their God is Lucifer. Before that, from the first degree through the 25th, all that matters is that the Mason has a belief in a God, a higher power, a creator, a source. Doesn't matter. It could be the Christian God, it could be Allah, and so on. So they're brought along very incrementally and very methodically. And of course, there's a lot of fallout. A lot of the Freemasons really never get past the 4th degree. So we talk about the Blue Lodges all the time. The Blue Lodges are the first 3 degrees. So what the system looks to do is to identify those Masons who are intrepid, those that they believe will push their agenda forward. And they're bound by their oaths. And they refer to their oaths as obligations. And they take their oaths and their obligations very, very seriously. And if a Mason breaches those oaths, the repercussions, the consequences can be severe. Now, what does severe mean? Well, it could mean that they are completely excommunicated, and if you ever had an opportunity to read some of their oaths, it could be something a lot worse, like death. And we have to understand that these secret societies, they trump the laws of the land or of your country. So their oaths and their obligations are, like I said, are very, very serious. It's serious business for them. So the ideology that encompasses what the world order, the New World Order, is trying to do has to do with Marxism. So if we go back to, as I mentioned before, the Frankfurt School, the primary members were Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and Herbert Marcuse. And cultural Marxism looks to dismantle the system of society and culture that we have today. If you go back to Karl Marx, think of him as a theoretician, and then we had Lenin, and the approach back in the day was to put Marxism or communism in place using force. That didn't work out too well. They tried that going back to the Russian Revolution, where the Bolsheviks came in. That was successful, but it was brutal. It was brutally done. When that happened, the Bolsheviks, the communists, were hoping that what would happen is that the workers throughout the world were going to rise up, and that was what was going to implement Marxism across the world, worldwide Marxism or communism, and that didn't happen. So enter groups like the Frankfurt School, which was a think tank out of the University of Frankfurt, Germany, and their approach was, hey, this method of using force and violence is not going to work. The way you're going to be able to implement worldwide Marxism is you have to subvert from within. So in order to dismantle the existing structures of society and culture, you have to penetrate them from within and then begin to dismantle it. They knew that it would take a long time to do this. They knew it would be a very methodical and incremental process. In fact, another organization that is closely tied to the Frankfurt School and part of the whole New World Order, one world government structure is the Fabian Society. And the Fabian Society, their logo displays a wolf in sheep's clothing. And the Fabian Society is very, very upfront about how they go about their business, which is incrementally and methodically. So if we go back to, as an example, go back to the Frankfurt School, because they're the ones that I believe play most significantly into the Beatles. So one of their leaders is a guy named Max Horkheimer, who I named before. And here's a quote from Max Horkheimer. The revolution won't happen with guns. So he's talking about the revolution of bringing in cultural Marxism, to bring in communism worldwide. It won't happen with guns. Rather, it will happen incrementally, year by year, generation by generation. We will gradually infiltrate their educational institutions and their political offices, transforming them slowly into Marxist entities as we move towards universal egalitarianism. So they talk a lot about egalitarianism. They come across sounding very altruistic, but I believe that's gaslighting. One of their approaches is to tell people, the masses, what they want to hear. In other words, they'll just lie to them, to placate them. And while the lie is in place and they're placating the population, they go about their business in a subversive way to start making the changes that they feel they need to make. So if we take a look at some of the high-level approaches that the Frankfurt School has put in play, their strategy, they very much wanted to create racial divides, to create change by creating confusion. So think about this as I go through these. There's about 11 of them. Let the audience think in terms of today. What's going on today? Do we have racial divides? We certainly do. Is there a lot of confusion? Yes, there is. And it's the teaching of sex, sexual behaviors to children, to undermine the school and the teacher's authority. Huge immigration to destroy identity. By bringing in all the immigration, by breaking down the borders, what they're doing is to eliminate nationality. And it's also a way, I'm talking in terms of how they approach this. It's a way to homogenize society. It's a way to erase the traditional values or the ancestral values that a particular person or family would have based upon their family's ancestry, their lineage. So as an example, Italians have a certain culture, the Irish have a certain culture, the French have a certain culture, the Mexicans have a certain culture. Well, they don't want that. They don't want individual culture. What they want to do is they want to homogenize it and have everybody believe and operate within a culture, one culture. And that's called pop culture. So the pop culture that we have was something that was put in play by the Frankfurt School and Tavistock. It's a creation. Pop culture is manufactured. It's not organic. It's not natural. It's completely manufactured. Another method of dismantling the culture in a society is to promote excessive drinking, to empty the churches. I talked about they have a big bullseye on Christianity, to create an unreliable legal system with a bias against the victims of crime, and we see that more and more these days, creating a dependency on the state or state benefits, dumbing down and controlling the population through mass media, and encouraging the breakdown of the family. They needed to erase the family nucleus. And one of their methods to break down the family nucleus was to attack the male. It's to attack the masculine end of the equation. So they went off and said that the current system is patriarchal, and a patriarchal system is bad. We need more feminine energy. It needs to be more women-based, because that will bring a softer approach to society. Now, a lot of people are listening to this, and they're probably thinking, well, I think that might be true. But the reason why they did it was so that they can get rid of the masculine input into society, into the family, where the male role was more oriented toward security and defending the family. To them, that was a barrier. They didn't want strong males because they knew if they had a strong male population with strong family values, that they couldn't push their Marxism over the goal line. Another aspect of that would be the women's movement. The methods coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock were telling women, especially in Western society and the United States, that why do you want to stay home and be with your children? Why do you want to raise kids? Why do you want to do that? That's really something that has been imposed upon you through societal norms. It's not really something you want to do. You're doing it only because you're told this is the way it is. That's a form of gaslighting. Because quite honestly, a lot of women were perfectly happy with their traditional role of raising a family because raising children was very important. So they introduced this dialectic into the equation, and we have this whole shift where women left the household, they went into the workforce, the father was also working, and now the children, well, who's going to take care of them? So that's when we started getting daycare, preschool, after school. So the children, in a way, become wards of the state. So the children have less face time or interacting with their biological parents. These are the types of tactics that were being used. Now, just going through all this, I know it's a little long-winded, but one of the biggest tools in the toolbox of Tavistock is the music and entertainment industry. And they knew that they could have tremendous influence and tremendous leverage and could make tremendous change through the music and entertainment business. Now, we see this all the time with Hollywood. All the Hollywood movies that come out are programming the population one way or another. There are agendas which are inserted into the scripts, even very subtly, but they are there. Some are not subtle at all. But music was another big lever that they could play. So in fact, let me just pull something up here. I want to read something. Another comment or another narrative that came out of the Frankfurt School was to use music to promote mental illness and destroy society. That verses set to music and repeatedly intoned or repeatedly played are very effective. And Adorno had said that music can promote a culture of pessimism and despair. And not just music, but they can do this through radio and television. So as I mentioned, when you look into the Frankfurt School on mainstream sources, it's going to come across as egalitarian. Oh, well, they're looking to try to do good things. They're trying to level the playing field. They want not equal opportunity, they want equal outcomes. For the longest time, we've heard, even on mainstream media, the cultural wars. What does that mean when we talk about the cultural wars? What cultures are at war? Well, it's the current culture, which in the minds of the Frankfurt School in Tavistock was predominantly Christian-based, especially in the United States, versus their culture. So they set off to attack the way of life that we were born and raised in so that they can take it down and pursue an agenda of communism. Now, if we go to the Beatles, in John Coleman's book, he brings up, now Coleman's book on the Committee of 300 is not about the Beatles, but he brings up the Beatles a number of times because they are tied into Tavistock, and he talks about the Frankfurt School, and he talks about Theodore Adorno, that Adorno was tied into the Beatles' music. So the Beatles were one of those levers, one of those big levers in the toolbox of the controllers to kick off the change in society and culture in the very beginning of the 1960s. This is why the 1960s was referred to as the counterculture. It was anti-establishment. So that was a big change they were looking to put in play. And the Beatles were the first manufactured band to come out with the sole mission or objective to social engineer on a grand scale. This is based upon my research. Okay, so I'll stop there if you have any questions. I don't want to just keep going here. Do you have a...
I hit mute because I am listening intently. And I have thoughts that I don't throw in because it's impossible to listen while you're talking. So you continue on. I don't know anything of what you're speaking because that part of your research I haven't run across yet.
Okay.
But I am now. So I guess in this moment, the continuing of the story is all on you.
Okay.
Please do.
So before we get to the Beatles, and I'll talk more about their role in changing society and culture, and you have to just excuse me because I'm doing all of this off the top of my head. I don't have very many notes in front of me right here. In the 1950s, actually I think it began in the 1940s, but it was more predominant in the 1950s, the Beat movement. Remember the Beat poets? And that would be Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, Jack Kerouac. Those are three names that those that know about the Beat movement would know about or relate to. Well, the Beat movement were cultural Marxists, and it's tied into the cult of Pan. So what do I mean by that? It's an ideology and a philosophy that says there should be no constraints. You should be able to do whatever it is that you want to do. If you go back to the 1960s, there was the old tagline, if it feels good, do it. And that pretty much summarizes one of the main narratives with cultural Marxism, that society is holding you down. Society is oppressing you. You are shackled. You're not pursuing your life. You're not pursuing your true and pure will. And that also ties back to Aleister Crowley. So the Beat poets, if you look it up on Wikipedia and you look up the Beat movement, it'll tell you that one of their traits was they were hedonists, unconstrained, do not follow societal norms, because to do so is oppressive. If you go back to Aleister Crowley, Crowley talks about his new eon, the eon of Horus, which is where the controllers are attempting to take us. Now, Crowley said that his eon of Horus began in the early 1900s, but before the eon of Horus, there was the eon of Osiris. And Crowley explained that the eon of Osiris, which equates to roughly to the Piscean age, whereas the eon of Horus is the age of Aquarius, he explained that his eon of Osiris, the Piscean age, was oppressive. Man was shackled. They did not follow their true will. Well, what are the cultural Marxists saying? They're saying the exact same thing. And so they're trying to lead the population to a new age where they're saying it's just going to be great. It's going to be a utopia. There's going to be equality everywhere. There's not going to be any wars. There's not going to be any starvation. What they're not telling anybody is the reason why there's not going to be any wars or any starvation is because they're not going to create any wars and they're not going to starve people. So enter Tavistock. Tavistock is the New World Order or the World Order, however you want to refer to them, the controllers. It's their brainwashing, mind control, and social engineering apparatus. Think of it as social engineering HQ. The Beatles were introduced to the United States in 1964. Of course, they were playing over in England in 1962, where they were being handled and groomed to be what they became, going back into their Hamburg days. And I have surmised and speculated that perhaps it's even possible that the Beatles themselves, especially Paul McCartney and John Lennon, were in a mind control program. Why do I say that? Because there are images on the internet of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison with bird cages on their heads. Birdcage symbolism in Illuminati speak means mind control. So if we think about where music was before the Beatles entered the scene, and I'll use the United States as the talking point here, knowing that they were getting their legs back in Britain back in 1962. Think about what happened. They blast out onto the scene, completely different type of music, different hairstyles, clothing, even attitude. Think about, for the folks that are listening to this, think about when the Beatles were doing interviews. There was this very quippy, witty, almost sometimes snarky attitude towards the, quote, establishment press, or whoever was asking the questions. This was all prescribed. This was all scripted to give the impression and the perception that the established system should not be listened to, that there was a new generation that was emerging. So there was a massive marketing push behind the Beatles that started going back to a guy by the name of William Mann, was a music critic for the Times of London. This goes back to, I think, 1963, where he was pumping the Beatles up as these brilliant composers. And this was done in order to get people thinking that way, to condition them and to brainwash them into accepting this new musical movement, this new genre of music that Tavistock was pushing on to the worldwide stage. And I should also mention, too, I was talking about the Frankfurt School. So when we talk about the Frankfurt School, we talk about the Fabian Society and Tavistock. These are all interwoven. They're all working together. And when I say they're all working together as part of the one world, one religion agenda that has been in place for a long time, that we really see being played out big time today for anybody that's paying attention to what's going on in the world, especially the World Economic Forum, organizations like that, Bilderbergs, Davos, the Trilateral Commission, the Council on Foreign Relations. All of these organizations are tied into the internationalist structure, the one world governance that's in play. That has been in play for a long time. So the Beatles were used to be that big lever in the music business and to change and shift the mindset, especially of the young people. They were not concerned about the older generation. In fact, Tavistock's approach was to create tension between the older generation, which would be the parents, and their children. That's exactly what they were looking for. They wanted the newer generation, they wanted the kids to see their parents as old-fashioned, as not with it. You used to hear the term, they're squares. So they were social engineering the young people. So what did this lead to? Well, this eventually led to activity that contradicted traditional values. This led to activity which was a break from the family nucleus. It was a break from what was considered to be acceptable values or acceptable behavior from a community or society. So what do I mean by that? The introduction of drugs, free sex, it was the entire hippie movement. All of this stuff was brought about by Tavistock, and the Beatles played a big part in it. So by the time the Beatles got to Sgt. Pepper was the stake in the ground which kicked off the psychedelic era. And the psychedelic era was very important to Tavistock and the controllers' cultural Marxist agenda. Because now we had people experimenting with drugs, looking to experiences outside of their physical senses. In other words, they would be able to drop acid. There are a lot of people I know that are thinking, well, this doesn't sound bad. And the reason why it doesn't sound bad is because we have been indoctrinated with this process, this social engineering coming out of the Frankfurt School and Tavistock with music and tying it back to the Beatles for 60 years. So it's the boiling frog phenomenon. It's so incremental, it's so methodical that you really forget what the baseline was. But if you go back in time, if you think about the societal structure in the 1950s in the United States, fast forward to 1969 and Woodstock. So let's just take a look at a 10 to 15 year period of time. Let's just say from 1955 to 1969. A huge change in how the young people were thinking and how they were operating and how they were behaving. It was massive. Now let's move from 1969 to current day 2024. And let's take a look at the music industry. And what do we see? We see an industry that is loaded up with satanic symbolism. It's huge. There's a huge, huge difference. And we can see, if we're honest with ourselves, if we're intellectually honest, we can see the degradation in society. We can see the degradation in the culture. We could see the degradation in people's thinking. There's so much less critical thinking. And that's because part of this whole process was to create a hive mind. I talked about before about homogenizing things. This is exactly what they want. Cultural Marxism wants to eliminate the individual, the focus on the individual, your individuality. They want that out of the way. What they want is consensus via a community. And the reason why individualism doesn't work is because an individual will critically think, and an individual will ask questions. So a community that is established on strong individualism, where people are resourceful, they're smart, they're resilient, well, that community is going to be very strong. But if we strip the individual out of the equation, and this is what they have done, that's why they keep talking about we're all in this together. We hear this all the time. Whenever there's some kind of staged event, we're all in this together. They want to dilute the thinking of the population down to a communal level with no strong individuals. This way, they are easily controlled. And the music industry has been paramount in pushing that kind of mindset. Also, they knew that the music industry in Hollywood would create Pied Pipers. Humans have an uncanny knack to follow. They decide who a leader is going to be. Now, a leader could be somebody that they worship, somebody they idolize. It doesn't have to be some kind of warrior. As an example, a band. A band would be a leader. They'll follow that band. And that band will take them down a particular path. The songs will have certain messages in them. And as I mentioned before, from the Frankfurt School, they said verses set to music and repeatedly intoned are very effective. So the point I'm trying to make is it's a massive mind control program. It's massive conditioning, social engineering on a gigantic scale. And the Beatles played a huge part in that. And I've spent a lot of time with my research trying to show this, putting forth evidence that they played a big role in this. Now, it's up to each individual, Julia, to accept it or not or believe it if it doesn't resonate with people. And for a lot of people, it doesn't resonate because, like I said, the indoctrination has been in place for so long, especially with regard to the Fab Four, 60 years. People will reject it out of hand. Nope, Beatle music is great, and they couldn't possibly have been part of something like this. Well, Beatles music is great. I loved it, but it was music with an agenda. And for those who question the whole Pied Piper bit, I think I mentioned before that cultural Marxism adopts, and Crowley as well, the cult of Pan. And I'll read you something here from the cult of Pan. Pan is the goat foot god of panic. That's where we get the word panic from, and pandemic. And it has to do with the sudden fear that seizes one alone in the forest. He is the god of vegetation, the vegetarians. His name has been translated as, quote, all, for he stands for the manifestation of nature, paganism. He is raw, undirected energy, the dance of blood along the arteries, and rising sap. He is sexual desire running amok, a god of unfettered bodily instinct. No social force contains him. He is the lord of death, of corruption, bodily decay, and dissolution. He is also the mindless mob instinct, the beast who takes control of man, the frenzy of the flesh-ripping orgy. Wine, women, and song quicken his pleasure. He plays his pipe, and the forest resounds with laughter and celebration. In the esoteric tradition of the West, he often borrows the attributes of Dionysus, Lord of the Vine, who presides over intoxication and its after effects. So, if we take a step back, we could see that what we see going on in society and culture today is exactly that. Cultural Marxists are pushing an agenda where no social force contains anything. There are no rules. Do as thou wilt. If it feels good, do it. Even the Nike logo, the tagline, just do it. It goes back to Crowley. It goes back to the cult of Pan. And this is all tied into this cultural Marxism and this push to put forth a worldwide communist state. So I know I said a lot there, so I'll just pause there for a moment and I'll go wherever you want me to go. But I thought it was important to get that baseline in play.
I appreciate where we're at. I do have a input, which was the 1939 Institution of the Western Standard Tuning, where A is 440, as created and implemented by the Rockefeller Foundation, straight out of military intelligence design, because 440 disrupts you on a cellular level, whereas 528 is what supposedly the Beatles recorded. Now that would bring about a whole refreshing new, just by frequency, anything that you pick up from that frequency, that is the frequency of love.
Yes, well, they did change 440, and 440 is disruptive. In fact, there are papers that are written, believe it or not, on mainstream medical sites that say one of the other frequencies that they say is beneficial is 432.
There's a whole solfeggio scale that goes from each chakra down from your red zone up above your head to the crown chakra. So I'm going to introduce to my audience the principles of science, frequency, and our limitations in a human body. And that's part of my message that doesn't really apply to this conversation unless you bring out some information.
Music the frequency was corrupted. This speaks to the level of control that they have achieved. And I talk about I'm talking about the controllers. They control your media. They control your music and entertainment industry. They control your politics. They control your government. They control your medicine. They control every major aspect of life that we interact with. They created the entire corporatocracy, the corporate system, corporate matrix. That's theirs.
To name names, I'm going to bring up the Rockefellers, also known as the Rothschilds, previously Orsini's, who claim to go all the way back to Egyptian Nimrod.
They trace their ancestry and their lineage back to Egypt, and some researchers will say that before Egypt, it was called the land of Chem, and before that it was Sumeria. It's a very, very complicated topic, as you probably well know, Julia. There's a lot of different interpretations and debates about where it all connects.
Just to have a moment here, can you define the difference between Satanism, which is the prince of darkness, Satan, versus Luciferianism, which is Lucifer, the bringer of light? Whereas they are not the same, do they represent a dichotomy of opposites that must exist on our plane of existence due to the sine wave going up and down? Just our frequency automatically defines a singular into a dual, yes and no.
There is a difference between Luciferianism and Satanism. In fact, Luciferians will be very adamant about that. Are there similarities? Yes. Both look to manifest as much as they possibly can in the physical world. They come at life from the perspective that being born in itself into the world doesn't have any meaning. In other words, you have to do things. You've got to create. You have to manifest what your life is going to be all about. Luciferians, they will claim that they balance their physical world manifestations and desires with their responsibilities to the spiritual world. In other words, their worship of Lucifer. That means that, at least in their minds, and based upon what I've looked at, they look to balance karma. So for everything that they do, which is considered not good or evil or bad, they got to make up for it on the other end. There's got to be something done that's good, that's beneficial, something that's helpful. Whereas with Satanists, a Luciferian might argue that they don't balance that scale. In fact, they don't have a scale. They don't pay very much attention, if any at all, to whatever spiritual aspect that they may have. Everything is about physical world manifestations. It's about attaining as much as you possibly can. It's perfectly fine to take advantage of anybody that you need to take advantage of in order to pursue and achieve your goals. It's not their problem that somebody is not smart enough to realize when they're being duped or when they're being taken advantage of. They'll say it's not our problem. Not my problem, you're not smart. That's your problem. So if I'm able to get something out of you because you don't know any better, that's just the way it goes.
Okay, well that brings me to the concept I'm currently looking into, is Paulism, or Christianity called Pauline Christianity. What do you think that means? To me, I don't know.
What the Luciferians do, they like to poke at Christianity. I mentioned before, if you go to John Coleman's book on Freemasonry, I think it's titled Freemasonry A to Z, Coleman's very clear that they really dislike Christianity. So a lot of times what they'll do is they will usurp Christian terms, Christian prayers, and they will twist it and use it for their belief system. So when we talk about Pauline Christianity, we're talking about the Apostle Paul. I don't believe that it's a coincidence that in the memoirs of Billy Shears, they talk about this religion called Paulism. Paulism, as it is described in the book, in the memoirs of Billy Shears, is a Luciferian-based spiritual system, a religion. It's a worship of the Beatles, and in particular, a worship of Paul McCartney. And is it a coincidence that they mapped it to Paulism and the Apostle Paul from Christianity? Let's just put it this way. I think it's very, very possible. If we go to John Lennon's song, I Found Out, Julia, he has a lyric in there that says, I've seen religions from Jesus to Paul.
I've never heard that song.
And in an interview that he did years ago, he said by the year 2000, Paul will be Jesus. What the controllers did as part of their culture war is to create a new religious belief system. And as weird as this is going to sound, because it does sound weird, trust me, I know, because when I was looking into it at first, I thought this is very, very strange and very odd. They created a religion around the Beatles. And that's Paulism. And people would say, well, what are you talking about? How are the Beatles a religion? A religion doesn't necessarily have to have all of its books and all that stuff. A religion is a mindset, it's a belief system. And there are followers. How many followers do the Beatles have? Millions? Now, of course, there are degrees of followers. Some are fanatical, others are not. And some people don't like the Beatles at all. But let's just talk about those that are connected into the Beatles. That following is huge. So they started off basic with their first album, Please Please Me, because Tavistock was not going to hit everybody over the head in 1963 with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. There's a process of acclimation, there's a process of getting people conditioned to incrementally accept the changes and the differences and the messages that are in the music. And the Beatles brought an entirely different mindset to the population at the time, especially to the millions and millions of fans that were following them. I mentioned earlier there was a change in attire, there was a change in how people presented themselves with their longer hair and their beards. Think about how many people formed bands because of the Beatles. And you might say, well, is that a bad thing? I formed a band because of the Beatles. But Tavistock creates the genres of music. And those genres of music have an agenda. They have a purpose. So when you had the British invasion, that led to classic rock. And then you had all these other genres of music that followed. They're all connected back to the Beatles. The Beatles are foundational. There is a different target audience that Tavistock is going after. They're shaping, they're conditioning, they're massaging it, and they're getting the table set for the next turn of the crank, the next genre of music. So think about like punk music. Think about the word punk. A lowlife, punk music, lowlife music. It's wordplay. Think about David Bowie. David Bowie was the beginning of the androgyny mindset. And then we had the glam bands like Poison and Motley Crue. The guys in the band were all dressed up in makeup and long hair. And think about the term grunge. The grunge bands. What does grunge mean? Grunge is what? Grunge is dirty. And then you had the whole hip-hop movement, which led to rap, techno music. There were some researchers that believed the whole techno electronic music is frequency-based, that it is actually conditioning people based upon the frequency of that music. I listened to an interview of Alan Watt going back years ago. Alan's dead now, but Alan used to be in the music business, and he was doing a lot of discussions on where the world is at and how it's being social engineered and and all that stuff. But he mentioned that, and I don't know how he knows this, but he said that George Martin was an expert in sound and acoustics and how the sound frequencies affect the listener. So what's implied in there is that understanding of how frequencies affect us, how it affects the psychology of human beings, the mind, was in play going back to the 1960s with the Beatles music and in all likelihood other music as well. This is something that they know about. This is technology that they know about. And it's progressed to the point now where we have this electronic music, the pounding beats, putting people into a semi-trance state. In fact, there were Taylor Swift concerts where people who attended the concert said that they have vague memories of attending the concert and the songs because they tranced out. We have to ask ourselves, well, how is that happening? Well, it's the frequency of the music. It's also the presentation with strobe lighting and stuff like that. So anyway, I'm going off on a tangent here, I'm sure.
Oh no, because right now the rave music scene is the popular, in my case, local scene. And so for me to have an ear of maybe someone who produces this music, I will shout out to Unify Mountain Sounds as a unsolicited sponsorship, but I would like these men to understand this process because they have an audience, a growing audience, and a really good show on time. I enjoy it.
For the average person, for most people who are unaware of this, it's just music. I'm just going to have a good time, going to have a couple of drinks, going to dance, going to socialize, But, what they don't realize is that the environment today, the structures, the societal structures have been shaped. So you're operating, remember earlier in the discussion I said that the culture we were given, fed to us, is pop culture. So all of this continues to be part of the pop culture indoctrination. And people are going along for the ride, just going with the flow. Very few people are questioning anything. Like I know I'm talking about this stuff, Julia, and there are going to be people who are listening that are going to think that I'm just a stick in the mud. I just don't like where things are, and I like the old traditional values and all of this stuff, which, by the way, there's a lot to be said about traditional values and a family nucleus. So I'm not going to fall prey to people that want to say that that's old-fashioned, because the new fashion is something that's turning this world upside down, except most people don't understand that and don't realize it. They think that the world just evolves organically. It's just the natural ebb and flow of how things go. And I'm going to say that that's completely false. The way the world moves is scripted. It's manufactured. It's engineered by the controllers. They're behind all this. Think about fads, folks. Think about, we'll just go back to the 1960s and let's talk about bell bottoms. All of a sudden, bell bottoms appear. All of a sudden, in the 1970s, remember platform shoes? I don't know how old you are, Julia, but I'm 65 and I remember this.
I remember Tina Turner playing the Acid Queen in those tight red shoes. First run at the theater.
Just think about how things just appear in the stores. How does that happen? Is that organic? Last week we had this set of clothing, and then this week, boom, a completely new set of clothing on the clothing racks in the stores. Different types of shoes, different types of hairstyles. All of a sudden, I remember in the late 1970s, I was in high school, polyester suits and jackets were in. All of a sudden, polyester just shows up. That's a way to try to understand how it is that these things are engineered. So they're pushing this stuff out there. When I say they, talking about the control system, to grab you, to get you, to bring you into their agenda and the mindset that they want you to operate in.
Who is the top of the controllers, to name names that we would recognize maybe in our society? And if you don't feel like mentioning names for safety reasons, you can just bypass the algorithm and kind of describe who I'm talking about.
The people that we are familiar with, like the Rockefellers, called the liberal Eastern establishment, many of these operators, these guys, belong to a secret society called the Pilgrim Society. It's a society, it's a secret society that many people don't know about. And it is closely connected into the British elite system. So you have the American Eastern establishment elites, and you have the British elites, and you have this secret society called the Pilgrim Society. But there are many other secret societies. Like I said, there's a federation of them, and they come under the umbrella of Freemasonry. Right? So the typical names, like the Rothschilds you mentioned before, these are real movers and shakers from an internationalist perspective.
Is that like Washington, D.C., Fleet Street, and the Vatican?
Yes, exactly. You have 3 sovereign city-states. You have the inner city of London, which is HQ because they control all of the money. There's 3 huge financial institutions that are behind just about every single corporation in the world. I'm talking about the multinational corporations. You have BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. In fact, there was an analysis that was done about 10 years ago where somebody actually mapped the connection points between all of the major internationalist corporations, and there were connection points from a financial perspective. And financial is the most important because that's the money. Nothing's going to get done in this world without money. So you have BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. That stuff emanates out of the inner city of London. Then you have the Vatican. And think of the Vatican as responsible for the spiritual part of the control system. And we could see now where the Pope is, he's massaging the Catholics and Christianity with opening up to other religions, to coexisting. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with coexisting. It's great. But what I'm saying is what he's doing is not because he's kind, and it's not because he cares about coexistence. He's doing it because it's part of an agenda that they're implementing to get this egalitarian, homogenized communist culture to solidify it, to nail it down. So then we have Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C. is also a sovereign city-state. Now, when I say sovereign city-state, folks, what I mean is they are sovereign. Washington, D.C. is not part of the Republic of the United States. The Vatican is not part of Italy. The inner city of London is not part of Britain. They are standalone. Think of them as sovereign countries within a country. And in the United States, Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, is a sovereign city-state, and they are the military and police arm of this internationalist conspiracy. This is why Washington, D.C. will never be a state. Washington, D.C. won't be a state because Washington, D.C. is sovereign. And to take it a step further, this means that the United States is under foreign occupation because our president, the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, all reside in the sovereign city-state of the District of Columbia, not the Republic of the United States. And the District of Columbia was formed back with the Act of 1871, where land was etched out from Virginia and Maryland to create D.C. And it was created on the behalf of the internationalist bankers. So we talked about the inner city of London, the Rothschilds. So this is a hard pill for a lot of people to swallow because they want to think that there's still a constitution in place. They want to believe that this is still a republic. It's not.
It's a corporation, and today is the anniversary of the Magna Carta. Just to throw that factoid I ran into a few hours ago.
Is today the anniversary of the Magna Carta?
Yes, and I was mentioning online that the people that said that the presidents were all related were half right, but a 12-year-old girl researched the female lines and at that time found 43 out of 44 of the presidents all related to King John Lackland, who didn't have any land, but he signed an agreement with the Vatican and the royalty became the landlords, and we are now the vassals.
Yeah, and the thing is, this also goes back to an entity, a secret society, which is very, very secret, called the Black Nobility. The black nobility are these families that go back to Rome. They believe and they operate under the guise that they own us. They own the world. They are de facto rulers of the world. So it's really funny because I'm just going through some research on them to read something I have here. The most powerful of the black nobility families are located in Italy, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Holland, and Greece, in that order. Their roots may be traced back to the Venetian oligarchs who are of Khazar extraction, the Khazarians, some folks might relate to that, and married into these royal houses in the early part of the 12th century, and so on and so on. According to researcher and author Dr. John Coleman, who I spoke a lot about during this our discussion here, a committee of 300 was established early in the 18th century. So John Coleman's book on the Committee of 300 is highly recommended. It's a fantastic book. But the Committee of 300 did not take on its present form until around 1897. So a lot of stuff took place in the late 1800s with regard to a lot of what's going on today. It was the segue, the lead into World War I, then it led into World War II, and so on. But here's something that's interesting, Julia, that I'll read to you. Documentary proof as to the existence of the Committee of 300 is not forthcoming, and it may be no more than a convenient phrase to describe certain key players. Socialist politician and financial advisor to the Rothschilds, Walter Rathenau, writing in the Weimar Press on December 24th of 1921, so Christmas Eve of 1921, said, now this is the financial advisor to the Rothschilds. This is what he said. Only 300 men, each of whom knows all others, govern the fate of Europe. They selected their successors from their own entourage. These men have the means in their hands of putting an end to the form of state which they find unreasonable. Exactly 6 months after that statement was published, Rathenau was assassinated. So there you go. So that would tell me that the Committee of 300 is real, and some of the black nobility actually sit on the Committee of 300.
I have a question about the O negative tie between a lot of our icons, such as John Lennon, Hitler, Manson, and so on. What is that like alien missing link? Because the Rh negative factor is what qualifies it as a positive or a negative, and missing means that there's something added to our DNA that creates a new bloodline. Do you have anything to say about that?
No, I don't. I mean, I've heard this, and I really don't know. I haven't looked too deep into it, but I will say this. Bloodlines are very, very important to the ruling elites. And I just said, going back to the black nobility and all of these other secret societies. Very, very important. So maybe the O negative, Julia, is maybe it's an attribute of a bloodline that is considered to be special. I don't know.
Well, I am studying that, and it's very important because even Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, is part of that group.
Well, didn't King Charles say he was related to Vlad the Impaler? I think he did.
The royalty of the family there is actually the published owner of the copywritten version King James Bible, published in their name, which makes it a real contrived, copyrighted book. It's a good book.
Yeah. So it's it's a crazy, crazy world. It is. I know I didn't talk too much about the Beatles.
Well, I do. I just actually thought, how is Billy Shears? Where was he born? Who is he? Do you know who his parents are? Or does he become a creation of the military intelligence that I think is behind it? Who's his daddy?
Yeah, who's his daddy? That's a good question. Well, there was a researcher, a colleague of mine, that did a presentation, and it was very compelling, and I think that she probably did figure out his family tree. The way she did it is the clues are in memoirs. I mentioned memoirs is an encoded book. So if you are very intrepid and you start taking a look at how things are worded and how things are encoded, you can possibly break the code. And if you break the code, then obviously you get to the truth. So Stacy, she traces his family tree back to 2 bloodlines. And these are blue bloodlines. The Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys. So the Douglas Hamiltons would be on his father's side of the house, and the Percys would be on his mother's side of the house. Now, what's interesting is in the book, he mentions that he has Campbell relatives, and the Campbell bloodline comes up through his mother's side of the family, the Percys. So the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys are two powerful bloodlines, and they're Scottish. If I had to guess, based upon Stacy's work, I think she probably is flying over the target. His father would have been Douglas Hamilton, Lord Douglas Hamilton. Now think of the line in the song A Day in the Life. Nobody was really sure if he was from the House of Lords. So that's another clue, I think.
It means more now than it did before I had this in my head.
Exactly. So before it was like, okay, well, it was just a lyric. And now, based upon Stacy's work, it makes you wonder, okay, is it just a lyric or was it a clue that was dropped? And almost 60 years later, somebody figured it out. Whether his family is the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys, whether that's his mother and father, I don't know. I can't say for sure. But her work is very compelling. One way or another, Billy's lineage, his ancestry, has got to be from elite bloodlines, Julia.
Well, sure. Do you have a date of birth or any idea of the legitimacy that they can conceal? Of course, they can give birth to a non-recorded human.
Yeah, people always ask me about, well, what about birth certificates? What about death certificates and all this stuff?
They're fake anyway.
Yeah, I mean, you're dealing with a very, very involved deep state operation. The Beatles are a deep state operation. They are a deep state psychological operation created by Tavistock with influences coming in from the Frankfurt School, the whole cultural Marxism thing that I was talking about earlier. But they can do whatever they want, Julia. They can make birth certificates. They can delete them. They can create death certificates. They can get rid of them.
Yeah.
They can do whatever they want. Now, Billy, he does tell us in Magical Mystery Tour, he alludes to the fact that he's 5 years older than he actually is. So that would mean that he was born in 1937. So the way you get there is he's supposed to be Paul McCartney. Paul McCartney was born in 1942. If he's 5 years older, as he states in Magical Mystery Tour, that means that he was born in 1937. Now, another researcher that I know, excellent researcher, Sally Whitty, believes that his birthday is September 11th of 1937.
That would make sense.
Yeah, she's very, very keen on that's in all likelihood his birthday. Originally, I thought it might have been September 9th of 1937 because he loves September 9th. He loves the double nines. You know, if I'm right, it's September 9th. If Sally's right, it's September 11th. Or we could both be wrong, and it could be a different date. But for sure, he was born in 1937.
Is his biological dad possibly Aleister Crowley? Because James McCartney looks just like Aleister Crowley. And Vivian Stanshall, if you'll cover that, I think we'll have a little bit more of a flow picture here.
So let's talk about Crowley. There is an image where takes half of Crowley's face and half of James McCartney. Now, James McCartney, for those that don't know, would be Paul McCartney or Billy's son. There's a picture where they take half of Crowley's face and half of James's face, and I mean, I have to admit, it looks a lot like Aleister Crowley. Is that proof of anything? No, it's not proof of anything. I mentioned Stacy's work where she takes Billy back to the Douglas Hamiltons and the Percys, and I think that that's probably more likely. Memoirs, it alludes a lot to the possibility that Crowley was his biological father. And how could that be? Well, Crowley was involved in a lot of sex magic. And so Billy could have been the result of a sex magic ritual. And by the way, in the occult, if a child is conceived from a sex magic ritual, they are considered special. And so they are earmarked for bigger and better things in life. This is something that's also explained in the book. But I'm not so sure that, honestly, that Crowley is his biological father. Do I think that Crowley was influential in Billy's upbringing? In other words, being taught the occult, being taught the ways of mysticism and the esoteric, in the ways of Thelema, that's Aleister Crowley's religion. Yeah, I think that that's very possible. In the book, he does say that he was mentored by Aleister Crowley for 10 years. So if Billy was born in 1937 and Crowley, we know, died in 1947, that's the 10-year period of time. In the book, he also mentions, Julia, that he was subjected to ritual abuse and mind control from an early age. And he goes back to the age of 3. So then we have Sgt. Pepper, released in 1967, and it says it was 20 years ago today that Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play. For whatever reason, many people believe Sgt. Pepper is a reference to Aleister Crowley. There is one piece of, maybe, I don't want to, it's not evidence, but it's speculative. In Rosemary's Baby, tannis root was used as part of a ritual in Rosemary's Baby. It's been a long time since I've seen the movie, so I'm not going to be able to recall the scene exactly. I looked it up, and my understanding is that tannis root can also be referred to as the devil's pepper, something to that effect. So I found that to be a little interesting. Sgt. Pepper, the devil's pepper, something, an ingredient that's used in occult rituals and ceremonies. What was Crowley? He was an occultist who performed rituals and ceremonies. So, maybe there's a tie there. But again, that's just conjecture on my part.
Well, the recent picture of one of the princesses of England has her dressed in the same dress as Rosemary's Baby's mom. The red dress with the white collar. Yes.
Right. Well, they filmed it in the Dakota, and John Lennon lived in the Dakota. And if you look at the poster for Rosemary's Baby, we have Mia Farrow. She has her head down on the ground, horizontally. And if you take John Lennon's Imagine album, you have the same imagery. Almost exactly the same as the poster for Rosemary's Child.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very weird. It's very, very weird.
Weird
I can send you the picture if you like.
Destiny. That's the third definition.
Is it?
Weird, yes, the weird sisters of the Greek tragedies. I love the word when people call me that. They think it's an insult. And I laugh and say, you have no idea.
Yeah. So, where else did you want to go? Vivian Stanshall, right?
Yes.
All right, so in the book, he tells us that he played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes. Now, for those of you who don't know who Neil Innes is, this is interesting, right? But Neil Innes was the brainchild behind the Ruddles, which was the parody band parroting the Beatles. They did a movie, All You Need Is Cash. I believe it was released back in 1976. Neil and team put together a bunch of songs that were very, very Beatles sounding. And, what they did was they took bits and pieces of different Beatles songs and they put them into the Ruddles songs. And it's a brilliant piece of work and it's a lot of fun. To be honest with you, I love the Ruddles music. I have a couple of their albums. So there's 2 albums I've got. I think it's the one from the movie, and then there's another one. It's a greatest hits called Archaeology or something. So, but a really good listen. So Billy tells us that he was in the Bonzo Dog Band with Neil Innes, and he has blondish reddish hair and he has a lighter complexion. He's very Scottish looking. Let's just put it that way. He's very Scottish looking. When you look at the pictures of Billy when he's playing a Stanshall character, and I have these images, I've done presentations on this. If you take a look at the eyes, it appears that Stanshall has this lazy eye, his left eye, relative to his right eye. So when I was going through the book and I was trying to confirm whether he actually played the character of Vivian Stanshall in the Bonzos, and by the way, there was another Vivian Stanshall that Billy hired outside of the Bonzos. So for people who are listening to this and saying, Vivian Stanshall died in 1995, the Vivian Stanshall that Billy hired, who was an actor and a musician, his name was Victor, that died in 1995. Billy played in the Bonzos, Victor did not. But Billy hired Victor so that his McCartney and Stanshall character could coexist. Otherwise, he would have the Batman and Bruce Wayne phenomenon, right? You never see them in the same room together. So anyway, to get back to my story here.
We're talking Victor Hayden, right?
Oh, I don't know if his name is Hayden. See, I went by Wikipedia and it says Victor Stanshall. So it'd be Victor, quote, Vivian Stanshall. Do I think his real last name, his surname is Stanshall? No. And it's very easy to change your names. It's a legal process and you can get your name changed. I think it's possible that Victor changed whatever his original last name was to Stanshall, because the book tells us he was totally into the part. In fact, he was he loved being Vivian Stanshall so much that that's who he became. Sometimes people will write me and say, I think actually you wrote me and you said that a friend of yours said, oh, well, I ran into him in a pub or a bar. A number of people have wrote me and said, oh, I ran into Vivian Stanshall in a pub or a bar. Well, the Vivian Stanshall that they ran into in the pub was Victor. It wasn't Billy. It was Victor. So in any case, so when you look at the Stanshall, Billy's version of Stanshall out of the Bonzos, he's got this thing going with his eye, his left eye. It looks like it's, a little lazy and it's a little bit wandering. So when I wanted to test the waters to see if this claim was true, I found images of Billy as Paul McCartney with the exact same eye issue. So you have to ask yourself, okay, so what are the odds that these guys, if they were two different people, would have the same eye configuration going on, where the left eye appears a bit wandering or lazy? And so when I continued my research, I found images where it was very clear that, in my analysis, that they are the same person, because I was able to look at the ears, I was able to look at the nose, the forehead, the eye, obviously, and the whole facial structure, because the facial structure, Billy's facial structure is much longer than Paul McCartney's, biological Paul's. Billy's is very oval, Paul's is more round. Now, the reason why that left eye seems like it's wandering or it's drifting is because Billy is blind in his right eye. And this was a discovery made by my colleague, my fellow researcher and friend, Sally Whitty. Sally is blind in one eye. She's blind in her left eye. Billy's blind in his right eye. So she was watching video and looking at images, and then it dawned on her. She says, wait, something's going on with his eye because it looks a lot like what my eye does. So the reason why Billy's left eye looks like it's wandering or drifting sometimes is because the right eye is not syncing with the left eye. There are times when the right eye is not in perfect alignment with his good eye, his left eye. So what happens is the right eye might be looking straight ahead and the left eye might be looking a little left, and therefore it looks like the left eye is wandering or drifting. But what's really happening is it's the right eye that is not tracking with his good eye. His blind eye is not tracking with his good eye. Now, what's interesting is, some people, they doubt this, they question this, but to me, after Sally took me through the evidence and I looked for myself, I think it's conclusive that he does not have sight in his right eye. Now, to back it up, what Billy did, he did an interview, I think it was on CBS or ABC. They were talking to him about this exhibit where they allegedly found these photos that biological Paul McCartney took back in 1964. They were these lost photos, and so they put an exhibit up to display these photos, and it was called Eyes of the Storm. So Billy's being interviewed on one of the American television shows. They're looking at this one particular picture. And so the interviewer says, well, it really takes an eye to take that type of picture. So Billy looks, he leans forward, and he goes, yes, my left eye. His left eye is the eye that he has sight in. We think that Billy was giving us a nod to the discovery, saying, you guys got it, you figured it out. Yeah, I am blind in my right eye. And that was his way of validating it. And what Masons do, they have this technique, it's referred to as masterfully speaking. So masterfully speaking is being able to tell the truth, but they do it in an encoded way. And so Billy did that in an encoded way. It's the same thing he did when I did my analysis and I concluded that the Beatles did not write all their own music and did not play on all of their recorded tracks. And the way I concluded that, we're not going to be able to get into it with this discussion, but I analyzed the Rubber Soul sessions. And quickly, once I was going through the official narrative, I thought, well, no, this could not have worked this way. So basically, what the official story was telling us, that the Beatles came into the Rubber Soul sessions. They entered the studio on October 11th. They began recording on October 12th, and they finished up on November 11th. So let's just say 30 days. So in that 30-day period of time, they essentially wrote, learned, rehearsed, arranged, and recorded 16 brand new songs in a 30-day period of time. They came in with a blank sheet of paper. Okay, it's very important to understand this. Some people want to argue that they had bits and pieces of this song or that song, and the official narrative will will say that they had, some of We Can Work It Out. They had a little bit of this and a little bit of that. But having a little bit of something when you're coming into a studio doesn't mean you have something. You still have to work it. And my argument with people is, okay, so pick the number of songs that you think that they had completed coming into the Rubber Soul sessions. Do you think it's 2 songs? Do you think it's 3 songs? Do you think it's 4 songs? Because I'm going to tell you that whether you're writing from scratch, whether it's 10 songs, 12 songs, 14 songs, or 16 songs, that's a lot. And I'm going to tell you that it's not possible. I don't care whether it's 10 songs or 16 songs, it's not possible. But in any case, I concluded that they did not do what the official narrative told us that they did for Rubber Soul. So what wound up happening was, what I concluded is, all of the songs were pre-written. All of the songs were pre-recorded by session musicians, and this was all being facilitated and put together by their producer, George Martin. And so when the Beatles showed up in 1965, on October 11th of 1965, to, quote, record Rubber Soul, what they were really doing was recording the vocals only, because the songs were written and the music was already recorded. What happened was, George Martin would cue up the songs, and I would think undoubtedly they had guide vocals that were already recorded so that the Beatles, John Lennon and Paul McCartney and George Harrison, could learn the melody lines of the songs. So they would listen to the guide vocals and then, okay, got it. They would overdub their vocals in place of the guide vocal. So that's what the Beatles did for 30 days. They did the vocals only on Rubber Soul, and I concluded that that was the model that was used for the Beatles throughout the 1962 through 1966 period. And then after 1966, when Billy, who replaced Paul McCartney in September of 1966, when he took over the band, his first album was Sgt. Pepper. Billy managed things differently than George Martin. George Martin stuck to outside songwriters, ghostwriters, and session musicians, whereas Billy wanted to bring John Lennon and George Harrison to have a bigger role in the actual songwriting and playing on the recorded tracks. So I concluded that from Sgt. Pepper on, but in particular I really want to say from the White Album on, we hear more of John and George of their own material, writing their own material, and playing on more of the recorded tracks, although the Beatles were still utilizing ghostwriters and session musicians even during the Billy period, 67 through 70. Billy validated that premise as well because he was on another talk show, and I think this was ABC, and he was talking about Let It Be, the Get Back sessions. And he said to record all of those songs, 14 songs in 30 days, or 12 to 14 songs in 30 days, was quite impossible. So that was, I looked at that as another nod, another acknowledgement, validating the research that I have put forth. I mean, why else would he say that?
Could you run down the list like Andy White played drums and then all the recognized verifiable online names and their instruments, and then run down the list of session musicians that are not credited anywhere that you've run across?
That's a tough one because that stuff is held very close to the vest. So I'll just go through some of the drummers to start. We know Andy White drummed on Love Me Do and P.S. I Love You, going back to 1962. That's acknowledged by the official narrative. George Martin was a professional. He was a professional producer. He was he was a composer. He had the George Martin Orchestra, so he was going to use top flight, top shelf musicians. So there's an interview with between George and, quote, Paul McCartney, or Billy. And in that discussion, Billy says, well, I know that you were used to using session players. And George Martin said yes. So I believe that Andy White drummed on more than just those 2 songs. I think it's possible that Andy White probably drummed on a lot of the songs on the first album, Please Please Me. Then I had a relative of the late, great session musician Ronnie Verrill reach out to me back in 4 years ago, 2020. They told me that Ronnie Verrill, who was her relative, also drummed on Beatles songs. So there's 2 right there. And then we have Bernard Purdie. And Bernard caused quite a controversy. Going back to the late 1970s, I believe in 1978 is when he first came out and said that he drummed on 21 Beatles songs from the early period. I think he was referring to, if I remember one of the interviews, the first 3 albums. So that would be Please Please Me with the Beatles and A Hard Day's Night. So that would mean that Bernard drummed on 21 of the songs that were on those first 3 albums. And maybe he drummed on songs on albums after A Hard Day's Night. Bernard, in an interview in 2004, it was a Red Bull interview, he said there were 4 drummers on the Beatles' music, and he was talking about the early period. So when I talk about the early period, we're talking about 1962 through 1966. He said there were 4 drummers, and Ringo was not one of them. Then I have a clip from Glenn Campbell. Now, Glenn Campbell played for the Wrecking Crew. So the Wrecking Crew, for those that don't know, watch the documentary. It's online. You can get it on YouTube. You can get it on Netflix. The Wrecking Crew were the musicians behind the music in the 1960s and 1970s. So all those artists that you think were on those records, they were not on those records. In fact, Bernard Purdie in that 2004 interview, Red Bull interview, says that 98% of the artists that you think were playing on their records were not playing on those records. It was session players that were on those records, and Bernard being one of those session players. But Glenn Campbell, who was an unbelievable guitar player and part of the Wrecking Crew and played on many, many albums. In fact, he was touring with the Beach Boys when they went out to play. He was part of the Beach Boy ensemble when they were playing live. He introduced the band Cream. So Cream would be Jack Bruce, Ginger Baker, and Eric Clapton. Now, all of those guys were session musicians themselves. Eric Clapton played on many, many records as a session guitarist, as did Ginger Baker and Jack Bruce, the bass player. And when he introduced Cream, he said that they were these top-notch session players, and they played on many records. They played on Beatle records, the Rolling Stones, Smothers Brothers records, and he named off a number of other acts in which Cream played on. And this introduction that Glenn did, this was done, I think it was June of 1968. So in June of 1968, he's telling us that members of Cream were playing on Beatle records. Very interesting, right? It's not until September of 1968 that we're told that George Harrison approached Eric Clapton to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps, to play the lead guitar part. So Glenn Campbell is telling us that Cream played on Beatle records 3 months before George Harrison asked Eric Clapton to play lead on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So what does that tell us? That tells us that Cream, not just Eric Clapton, were playing on Beatle records. I mean, that's what it says to me. Then there was a post by Jimmy Page. I just saw it recently. I think it was on Instagram, I think. I have a copy of it. And Jimmy said that he played on many records as a session musician. Now, that's what Jimmy Page was. He was a session player. He started his session work at age 17. And in that post, he said that he played on many records, including the Beatles' Hard Day's Night album. Now, people wanted to argue with me and say, no, he meant he played on the instrumentals from the soundtrack of the album. And I said, well, that's not what he said. He didn't say he played on the soundtrack of the Hard Day's Night film or the soundtrack pieces to the Hard Day's Night album that was released in the United States under the United Artists label. In the United States, we got some Beatles songs mixed in with the soundtrack music. And people were trying to tell me that that's what he was talking about. I said, no, I don't think so. Beatles' official releases were not the U.S. releases. It was not Capitol. It was not VJ. It was not United Artists. It was the EMI Parlophone releases. And on the Hard Day's Night album, released in the UK, their third UK release, it was all original Beatle music. If you logic through this thing, it sure read to me like Jimmy Page was saying that he played on Beatle records. And he specifically mentioned A Hard Day's Night. Now, other potential musicians, Vic Flick, great guitar player, session musician, played with the George Martin Orchestra. He actually played on the song Ringo's Theme, the soundtrack from the album, from the film, I should say. That was Vic Flick. He also did the James Bond sounding intro of Help. That was Vic Flick. But I think Vic Flick was playing on a lot of Beatle records. And the fact that he was with the George Martin Orchestra says to me that, in all likelihood, that's definitely the case. Another person would be Big Jim Sullivan. Big Jim Sullivan was another in-demand guitar player. He was also a very, very good sitar player. In fact, Big Jim released 2 sitar albums back in the late 1960s. And if you read Wikipedia, it explains that Big Jim used to visit George Harrison at his home. And I guess we're to conclude that Big Jim was giving him sitar lessons. Well, I believe it's not George Harrison playing sitar on Norwegian Wood from the Rubber Soul album. It's Big Jim Sullivan. Again, we have to bring this back to the music business is a business. And they have their set of resources, skilled session players that are going to be called in to create this music. A producer like George Martin is not going to jerk around in the studio with subpar musicianship. He's just not going to do that. He's got a job to do. So I believe that's what he did. He brought in the session players that he knew, the session players that he had worked with, and that's who we're hearing on those early Beatle albums, especially, like I said, between 62 and 66 until things changed up a little bit, starting with Pepper, especially the White Album going forward through 1970 and into their solo careers. So I hope that answered your question.
Well, there was a comedian that I traced down. I don't remember his name now, but he was the one giving the quote that Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. August 5th of 1966, there's an interview where Paul McCartney reveals that they're not so good and that they don't write between songs. Do you want to run that through? And then you can also touch on either subject.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. So the official narrative tells us, wants the flock to believe that the Beatles were writing music all the time. They were writing music, when they were on vacation. They were writing music on film sets. They were writing music in hotel rooms. They were writing music in the studio while they were gigging. Every waking moment of their life, they were writing music. And that's how come they were so prolific, because nothing mattered more in their life than sitting down and writing music. And so in an August 5th, 1966 interview, this is the same day that their 7th studio album, UK studio album, Revolver, was released, John Lennon and Paul McCartney did an interview with the BBC at Paul McCartney's home. And during that interview, Paul McCartney drops a number of bombshells. One of them was that they did not write in between albums, he said, normally. Maybe one or two. And because he used the word maybe one or two, maybe could also mean 0. And Paul said, we wrote in great big batches whenever we had to go to the studio to record an album or a film. What he really meant was to do an album, because the songs from the film were really the songs from the album. So just to kind of streamline that a little bit. And during that interview, the BBC interviewer says, well, I always thought it was quite impossible to sit down and bang out 12 songs in short order. How does that work? And John Lennon said, well, it is sometimes quite impossible. So what we're getting from that interview is, well, first of all, Paul McCartney takes the official narrative of them writing music all the time and completely blows it out of the water. He's telling us, well, that's not true. We wrote in great big batches. But his explanation of writing in great big batches creates another problem. And that is, well, how do you do that? How do you sit down and have a situation where you have creativity on demand, where the creative flow and the creative juices are you just turn it on like a switch? How do you do that? Well, for anybody who's a songwriter, anybody who's a musician knows that that's not how it works. You don't sit down and write songs in great big batches. Now, can some songs come quickly? Yes. But other songs can take a long time to come together. He created a problem for the official narrative, but he also created a problem where he didn't explain how the whole writing in batches piece worked. In fact, what they said was that it was very difficult. He said that for the last album, and I think he was referring to Revolver because the interview was on August 5th of 1966. He said with the last album, it took us weeks just to get one song done. Weeks. And you're sitting there and you're scratching your head, at least I was. I'm thinking to myself, okay, Paul, so it took you weeks to get one song written, and we're thinking in terms of Revolver, but you guys banged out 16 songs in 30 days for Rubber Soul? Well, that doesn't make any sense, because 30 days is weeks. In that same interview, he says that they were not very good musicians, and they were limited. As a band, they were limited. And in that interview, he also says that they didn't have to show themselves up for the recording of yesterday. Now, my British listeners said, well, not showing yourself up means not embarrassing yourself. So let's just take it from that angle. So Paul was saying, well, we didn't have to embarrass ourselves for the recording session for yesterday. What does that mean? I'll tell you what I think it means to me. It means that he didn't play on yesterday when the official narrative is telling us that he played acoustic guitar. He laid down the acoustic guitar track for the song yesterday. But in that interview, he's saying, I didn't. And he said, and we didn't have to show ourselves up again. That was his quote. We didn't have to show ourselves up again. So it was a very revealing interview. A lot of people that are Beatle fans and want to argue with me and want to debate me on my research, they don't like that clip. They don't like that clip at all. At all. Because this is not Mike saying this. They're hearing it from the horse's mouth, and that's, they don't want to hear it.
What are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes?
Exactly.
Well, I was going to place myself in this story for a minute. 18 days later, I was born August 28th, 66. And a day later, they quit playing their music. So I was immediately out of a job. And then approximately 2 weeks later after that, the Faustian deed of Paul is dead started as a rumor which has two different pictures of two different people side by side. They are obviously two different people because new Paul is 4 inches taller with blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes different than Paul's. But the Who said it perfect when they said the parting on the left is now parting on the right, which is his hair.
That's right. The new boss is the same as the old boss. They're talking about the agenda. So when the Who sang about the new boss being the same as the old boss, they're talking about the agenda. The parting on the left, the parting on the right, different guy, but guess what? The agenda stays the same. So, and the Who they knew they were totally on board with the replacement of biological Paul back in 1966. The prevailing conspiracy theory says he was killed in a car crash, but that's just the prevailing conspiracy theory. It's also possible, and I've covered this in my research, that he was a ritual sacrifice based upon a Faustian bargain that Memoirs tells us was performed back in October of 1963. So after their release of their first UK album, Please Please Me, but before their second release with the Beatles, there was a Faustian bargain that was sandwiched in between those two releases. Now, whether that Faustian bargain, whether that's true or not, or it happened, I don't know. I can tell you that I do believe that these Faustian bargains are real. It's called Going to the Crossroads. There's a book titled Lenin Prophecy, written by the author Joseph Niezgoda, and he believes, I should say that he hypothesizes that John Lennon actually entered into a Faustian bargain in December of 1960 in order to launch the Beatles, to put them on the trajectory that they ended up on. Because the Beatles went to Hamburg in August of 1960, no songwriting skills, not very good musicians, in fact, mediocre at best, and I'm probably being kind with that description. And then 3.5 years later, they land in the United States in February of 1964 to conquer America. That was the tagline, the Beatles conquer America. So you have to ask yourself, how does this ragtag bar band with no songwriting abilities and very mediocre musicianship in 3.5 years, they're sitting on the shores of the United States with all of this major media hype behind them, doing major worldwide concerts? Well, I don't know. Seems like maybe something happened.
Toppermost to the poppermost, I think it was said.
Yeah, that's right. So it's a very interesting tale, Julia. Very interesting story.
No, this is perfect because I've said that the record companies take their master tapes into a ritual room, I guess, within the building and perform, I guess, prayers or whatever you want to conjure up as an equivalent term, but they pray over the masters and they conjure up whatever spirit goes behind it. Now, if this is the case in all record companies, then how would EMI now translate to Universal Music Group, who is the current head of a lot of these one-eyed Illuminati bands that showcase that?
Yeah, is that a question?
The question is, if EMI was the unseen hand in some ritualistic inclusion, is that same power over the industry today held with the Universal Music Group, who does the Wizard of Oz and all of the things that are referenced in an occult narrative? But they all show one eye. That one eye displays their connection to the Illuminati.
Yes, I mean, I think it's still alive and well. I mentioned earlier that if we look at how music has developed, how much darker it has gotten since let's say 1960 to current day, and we see all of the satanic overtones, a lot of the choreographing is ritual dancing. We can see this. There are clips on YouTube where that type of choreographed dancing takes place in Masonic lodges. And the person that you're referring to that talked about how Satanism plays into the master tapes where there was a ritual or a ceremony or some kind of incantation or whatever that took place before the release of an album to embed the Satanism into the actual music. Now, whether somebody believes that or not, that's up to you. According to John Todd, this is the person that made this claim and was in the music industry, that this was done.
Okay, before I forget, what is Stacy's last name? Because I don't remember hearing it. So we can research her research.
Oh, yeah, I don't get into Stacy's last name.
Okay,
She just goes by Stacy.
I just wanted to know if there was reason to look into what she's
Yeah,
researching.
some researchers want to fly under the radar because, to be honest with you, this whole topic can be very toxic, especially within the Paul is Dead community itself. I mean, outside the community, by Beatle fans, they don't want to hear this message, what you and I are talking about. And a lot of people within the Paul is Dead community, researchers included, there's a lot of hostility that comes my way because they only want to talk about the replacement of Paul McCartney. That's it. They want to talk about from 1966 going forward. They don't want to talk about pre-1966 and what possibly went on and how the Beatles were manufactured and engineered and how it goes back to Tavistock and the Frankfurt School. How there were ghostwriters and session players and all of this stuff. They don't want to hear that stuff because that's heretical.
Cognitive dissonance.
A lot of people, they want to hold on to the Cinderella story. They want to hold on to the story that was given to us. And I understand, okay? I was there at one time. It's a great story. 4 lads, 4 scousers coming out of Liverpool, middle-class guys, connecting to Brian Epstein, record store owner. He eventually gets them a record contract with EMI Parlophone, and then that leads to unprecedented fame and fortune. Who doesn't love that story? It's a great story. It's not true. That's what I deducted, but it's a great story. It's a Cinderella story. Going back to, like, some researchers really don't want to, who work with me, don't want to put themselves out there because they don't want to deal with all the negativity. They don't want to deal with the hostility.
I always bring attention to things that other people react violently and then usually block me. So anybody that's like that probably has not gotten to this point in the show anyway. And as my first show said, my guest said, well, what if I get nervous and I don't know what to say? I said, don't worry. Nobody's listening anyway. His answer was, then why are we doing this? I said, I don't know. But anyway, we move forward into now.
Well, you're always going to, whenever you're digging into something that cuts across the grain, it cuts across official narratives, it cuts across the indoctrination that people are getting out of their television sets and all of the media and so on, their government and politics. Whenever you cut across the grain, you're going to get backlash because people are indoctrinated. People are conditioned. They're brainwashed to believe certain narratives. And a lot of people are so married to their belief system, there's no budging. And so when you say to them, hey, you know what? I don't think you have everything in your box that you think you do. No. They become triggered. They become very emotional. And they become very angry. They start lashing out. I see this all the time. All the time.
Well, they say opinion requires no research, no evidence. So it's the lowest form of knowledge you can have. And then by that same token, a belief system is just that. It's a belief system. It doesn't make it real.
Right. Because you believe it doesn't mean it's true. And I tell people that all the time. They'll write me in comments and say, well, I believe. And I said, don't believe. No. It's 2 different things.
Yes, because people tend to research nothing and base their opinion and belief system on a narrative they haven't even really considered.
Oh, I can't tell you how many times, Julia, it's so easy to tell when people show up on my channel and they are triggered by the title of the video. So as an example, did the Beatles write all their own music? They didn't even watch the presentation. Their reaction is, of course they did. Why would you even remotely want to question whether the Fab Four wrote all their own music or not? Of course they did. This is not something that we need to look at. So then they write a comment based upon being triggered. And so I say to them, look, watch the presentation. I know you didn't watch it. I know you didn't. Or I can also tell when they've gotten to a certain point in the presentation because their comments are focused on that particular segment. As an example, you brought up the August 5th, 1966 BBC interview where Paul says that they wrote in great big batches and they weren't very good musicians. So I'll get comments that in a 2.5-hour video where that's 15 minutes of the interview or 20 minutes of it, they will major on that. They will dig into that. They will exert all this energy to try to twist what Paul said, to make it something other than what he said, to infuse their own narrative in order to placate their belief system, in order to appease what it is they want to believe. And I'll say to them, well, you didn't get past the first 20 minutes, did you? You know, so that's when they short circuit. And I'm not poking at anybody, okay, folks? That's not my deal. I don't want to poke at anybody. But what I do request, if you're going to come to the channel, watch the presentation. Because if you're not going to watch it and comment, then fair is fair, right? So if you don't have time, I don't have time. So what that means is if you're not going to spend any time taking a look at what it is I put together, but you want to have the ability to comment, well, you know what? Then I have the ability to say no. I want the comments to be constructive. I want value-add comments based upon an evaluation and an assessment of what was presented. Not because you got triggered and you short-circuited, you had an emotional moment. That's not value-add. That's not having an intellectual discussion.
It's an argument.
It's an argument. It's a debate.
We have a clinic
it's being
for that.
emotional.
Ask Monty Python.
Yeah.
The same applies to when an 8-year-old is videotaped asking Buzz Aldrin why we've never been back to the moon. And he says, because we've never been there.
Right.
And then people try to, justify. He even tries to explain it. But the reality is that's what he said. And the same with Olivia Harrison calling Paul McCartney Billy is a video and a whole compilation of examples just like that.
On that clip where Olivia Harrison says, hello, Billy, it was at the premiere for the concert for George. And she says, hello, Billy. And I've got people writing me saying, no, she said, hello, babe. I'm like, what? You think she said babe?
That's funny. Gaslighting.
I'm not kidding you. Go to that video and page down. And I'm like, you got babe out of that? No. You have to go get a hearing test.
Or a thinking test.
She said Billy. So, anyway. So, I don't know. We're running low on time here, Julia.
I see that you've run 15 minutes past the 2:30 and
that's
an
okay.
hour and something above the 4, so I know you have somewhere to be. And it sounds like we've exhausted at least this portion of the conversation. Now, is there any possibility I can coerce you, pay you, or whatever to send that audio track to me as soon as possible?
Yeah, I'll send it to you as soon as we're done.
So I am at your mercy for thanking you. I have nothing but the most utmost respect for your research.
Oh, thank you. I'm going to send you this audio now before I head out.
Okay, great. I hope you have a great day with your daughter. Tell her I said hello.
I will. Thank you.
Thank you.